Somewhere in a locked drawer in Harrington Motors Group sat a cracked leather logbook with Grant Boone's name written in it, in ink, 8 years after everyone in the company swore he had sold his stake and walked away. Nobody had opened that drawer in years. Nobody thought they needed to. The tow truck idling in the service lane that morning looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a battered, dented, 12-year-old flatbed wagon parked crooked beside a row of showroom fresh sedans wrapped in ribbon for the cameras. Josephine Harrington stepped out of a car that cost more than the truck 4 times over, smoothing her blazer, already smiling for the photographer trailing her, and stopped when she saw it blocking the edge of her frame. She didn't recognize the man behind the wheel. Faded navy jacket, sleeves rolled, a stitched logo so old the company had redesigned it twice since. He wasn't looking at her. He was listening to something under the hood tick as it cooled, head tilted with the particular stillness of a man who has already diagnosed the problem and is simply confirming it. "You drive that junk truck?" she said, loud enough that 2 technicians turned, loud enough that the photographer lowered his camera to watch instead of shoot. It wasn't really a question. It was a caption she was writing out loud, already picturing the headline about her modernized fleet, already deciding this rust-streaked eyesore did not belong in it. Grant Boone looked at her for a second longer than comfortable, the way he looked at anything before he answered it, and said nothing at all. Stay to the end to see what he asks for instead of the money he was owed. Because the truck wasn't just parked in her lot. Legally, so was 30% of everything around it, the showroom, the service bays, the name stitched above the door, sitting quiet and unclaimed in a drawer nobody had opened in 8 years, waiting on paperwork nobody in that parking lot had ever bothered to read. 2 hours earlier, none of that had mattered yet. What mattered was 2 knocks on a door, never 3, and a voice on the other side already awake. Grant knocked twice on Elsie's door at 6:40, the way he had every school morning since she was 5, and heard the particular rustle of a girl already sitting up, already dressed to the sock, waiting to be asked rather than told. She met him in the kitchen with her hair half braided and asked him to finish it, which he did slowly, watching his own hands work the way he watched an engine, patient past the point where patience usually runs out. The lunch went together in its usual order: sandwich, apple, the small thermos she'd chosen herself 2 years back, for the cloud sticker peeling at one corner, which she refused to let him replace. He wiped the counter where flour dust from her cereal had settled and, for just a moment, saw the same table years younger, Diane hunched over dispatch logs with a mechanical pencil behind her ear, marking down truck numbers in her small, exacting hand, telling him the columns had to balance before she'd let either of them go to bed. He didn't linger on it. He never did. Not in front of Elsie. He folded the memory the way he folded her lunch bag, once, cleanly, and set it aside. 2 knocks, Elsie said at the door, half a question, half a ritual check, the way she'd started saying it, once she was old enough to notice patterns. "Always 2, he said. At Rhodes Elementary, he watched her walk in without looking back, which he'd decided long ago meant she felt safe rather than that she'd forgotten him, and then he drove to the yard, because a tow request had come in before sunrise, and someone had to bring the truck around before the morning got away from everyone. He had no idea, pulling into the lane, that the morning already had plans for him. The dressing down did not stay quiet for long. Josephine's first line drew a small crowd by accident. A photographer never leaves when there's a better photo forming. And by the second line, she had an audience she hadn't planned for, and clearly intended to use. She circled the truck once, arms folded, describing it as an eyesore, a liability, a stain on the brand experience she was building around the new fleet, and said she wanted it gone from the lot by the week's end. Off the lot, off the account books, off her photographs. Service techs drifted to the open bay doors to watch. Silas Larkin came out from behind the parts counter with a clipboard he didn't look at again, planting himself against the counter's edge with the stillness of a man who has watched this kind of scene before and knows exactly how it ends, though he said nothing yet. "It runs 11 recoveries a week on a route nothing else on this lot can manage," Grant said, evenly, not raising his voice, not stepping back. You'd replace it with what? It wasn't a defense. It wasn't even really a question aimed at getting an answer. It was the kind of sentence that turns a demand back on the person making it, and Josephine felt the shift without immediately understanding it, the way a person feels a step they expected to be there suddenly isn't. That's not the point, she said, checking her phone mid-sentence out of habit more than need. Let's keep this efficient. I want it gone. You're the one who owns the company, Grant said. You'll get what you ask for. He said it plainly, without weight, and turned back to the tow hitch he'd been checking before she arrived, running his thumb along a bolt that didn't need checking anymore, just to have something steady to do with his hands. The photographer, sensing the moment had gone flat rather than sharp, lowered his camera again. Silas watched Grant's back for a long moment, unreadable, then went back inside without a word to either of them, though something in the set of his jaw suggested he already knew a good deal more about that truck's history than he was in any hurry to say out loud. Grant didn't mention the logbook that day, or the next. He went back to the yard, finished the recoveries on schedule, picked Elsie up at the usual hour, and said nothing at dinner about being humiliated in front of a photographer, because there was nothing to be gained by handing his daughter that weight before he understood the shape of it himself. 3 days later, after Elsie was asleep, he drove back to the dealership using the after-hours entrance and the small brass key he'd never turned in, because nobody had ever asked for it back, because nobody had thought to. The archive room behind the old finance office hadn't changed in 8 years. The same gray filing cabinets, the same smell of dust and toner, the same locked drawer at the bottom of the third cabinet that had never once, in all that time, been rekeyed. The logbook was exactly where he remembered leaving it, cracked at the spine, the leather gone soft and pale at the corners. He carried it home instead of reading it there, some instinct telling him this needed to happen at his own kitchen table, under his own lamp, with nobody watching him do the arithmetic of his own erased history. He read by the low light for 3 nights running, cross-referencing dates against a typed buyout letter he'd requested from HR under the plain cover of a routine records inquiry, the kind of request nobody flags because nobody imagines it means anything. The letter claimed his signature, dated 8 years back, transferring his 30% stake in the recovery division to the company in full. He read it 4 times. He had never seen it before in his life. The ink in the logbook told a different story, in a hand he recognized as his own from 20 years back. Dispatch notes, ownership percentages, his name beside his father-in-law's on the founding page, and no entry anywhere recording a sale, a transfer, a signature, or a single dollar changing hands. Whatever had happened 8 years ago, it hadn't happened on paper he'd ever touched. He sat with that fact a long time, the house quiet except for the furnace ticking, Elsie's door closed at the end of the hall, and did not call anyone that night. He simply closed the logbook, set it beside his keys, and went to check on his daughter before bed, the way he always did, 2 soft knuckles against her doorframe, no knock at all this time, just looking. He requested the meeting through the front office 2 days later, using no more urgency than he'd used to schedule an oil change. Josephine agreed to 15 minutes, mostly out of the mild curiosity of a woman who assumed the tow truck driver wanted to argue about his job. He laid the logbook open on her desk instead, beside a folder of ownership records he'd pulled from public filings, and said nothing while she read. Silas Larkin stood by the door, arms folded, a witness rather than a participant, until Josephine looked up and asked, flatly, whether this was some kind of joke. He co-founded the recovery division, Silas said, 20 years ago, with her father. A nod toward Grant. I was here. I watched them build the first bay by hand. He never signed anything giving that up. Not that I ever saw, and I saw most everything that came through this building for 26 years. Josephine's eyes moved from the ledger to the ownership filings to Grant's face, slower each time, as if recalculating something with each pass. You drive the tow truck, she said. It wasn't quite a question anymore. I drive the tow truck, Grant agreed. I also own 30% of the company paying your salary. Both of those are true. I'm not sure which one surprises you more. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The office, usually filled with the low hum of her assistant's phone and the traffic outside, went entirely silent. The kind of silence that isn't peace, so much as a room recalibrating itself around a fact it had never accounted for. Josephine set the logbook down very carefully. The way people handle something they suddenly suspect might be worth more than they understood a minute ago. Which, in every sense that mattered, it was. Bertram Fairbanks did not take 15 minutes to arrive once word reached him. He came in with a folder of his own, thin and precise, and set a typed buyout letter on the desk beside the logbook, as if the two documents were equals, which, on paper, they nearly were. "This matter was settled 8 years ago," he said, tapping the signature line. "Mr. Boone signed his stake over during the merger. It's notarized. It's filed. Whatever sentimental value that old book carries, it doesn't override an executed legal document." He looked at Josephine rather than Grant while he said it, already steering her back toward the calendar on her desk, the board's sale date circled in red, 11 days out. "We have a valuation closing in 11 days. I'd strongly advise we not let a filing room discovery derail a sale this company needs." "I never signed that," Grant said, without heat, without repeating himself for emphasis. He didn't reach for the letter. He didn't need to. "Then you won't mind an independent review," Fairbanks said, already turning for the door, already treating the matter as closed. Grant minded very little, in fact. He hired the examiner himself, out of his own pocket, a woman named Delacroix who worked out of a courthouse annex and had testified in exactly this kind of dispute more times than she could count on both hands. He brought her the buyout letter and, at her request, every sample of his handwriting the dealership's old files still held. Invoices, dispatch logs, a decades-old warranty claim he'd forgotten he ever filled out. Josephine watched all of this happen without interfering, and without, for the first time in longer than she could remember, checking her phone in the middle of it. The examiner's findings arrived 9 days before the board's scheduled vote, typed in the same flat, procedural language as everything else in that world of forms and filings, and they said, in substance, that the signature on the buyout letter had not been written by Grant Boone's hand at all. It had been traced, stroke for stroke, pressure point for pressure point, from a service invoice on file since 1997, the kind of routine paperwork nobody thinks to protect, because nobody imagines it will ever be used against them. Silas brought the second piece 2 days after that, and he brought it to Grant's kitchen table rather than the office, setting down a water-stained accounts ledger he'd found in a storage unit the dealership had stopped paying attention to years ago, back when records still lived on paper before anyone digitized a thing. "Nobody ever scanned this," Silas said. "Nobody thought it was worth the time." He opened it to a marked page. "There's a wire, 8 years back, paid to a shell account, finder's fee, it says, for facilitating an undervalued asset sale. Guess who signed the authorization?" Fairbanks's name sat at the bottom in the same tidy hand he used on every memo in the building. "He sold the division cheap 8 years ago and got paid on the side for arranging it," Silas said. "Buried Grant's ownership first, so there'd be nobody left withstanding to ask why the number was so low. And unless I miss my guess, he's got the exact same arrangement lined up with the buyer circling this new sale." Grant looked at the ledger for a long while, the way he looked at everything, patient past the point most men would have already reacted, and said only, 11 days isn't enough time to bury this twice." The board convened early, at Josephine's own request, 6 days ahead of the scheduled vote, and Fairbanks was asked to explain the wire transfer before he'd even taken his seat. He tried the same tone he'd used in her office. Settled matter, notarized document, don't derail a necessary sale, until the examiner's findings and the old ledger were placed side by side on the table in front of him, and the room did what rooms do when a story stops holding together. It went quiet, and stayed quiet, and let the silence do the work no one wanted to say aloud. Fairbanks resigned his position before the board could vote on removing him, which everyone in that room understood to be its own kind of confession. Josephine asked Grant to stay after, once the room had emptied, and did not open with an offer. She opened with a plain accounting of her own failure, No softer language than that. I looked at a work jacket and a dented truck and decided I already knew everything about the man wearing it, she said. I didn't check the records because I didn't think there was anything in them worth checking. That's on me. Not on Fairbanks, not on the paperwork. Me. She slid a folder across the table. Full restoration of his 30% stake, back pay calculated across 8 years, a public statement already drafted for release. Grant read it without any hurry, the way he read everything, and set it down without signing it. Keep the money, he said. Put it where it does more good than it would in my account. Silas has been threatened with pension cuts for testifying honestly in this building for 26 years. Fix that first, in writing, today. And start an apprentice program in my wife's name. Diane ran the numbers in this company before anyone here remembers her doing it. Let her name teach the next batch of kids what happened when it stopped mattering, whether the ink told the truth. Josephine looked at him for a long moment, something behind her eyes finally settling rather than calculating. That's it? That's what you want? Diane used to say the ink never lies, Grant said. Only the men holding the pen do. I'd rather fix the pen than collect on the lie. Nobody in that room applauded, and nobody needed to. The silence itself carried more weight than praise would have, the particular quiet of people who have just watched a man decline the very thing they assumed he'd been fighting for all along. 3 months later, Fairbanks's name no longer appeared on any door in the building, and the sale that would have erased Harrington Motors Group into a competitor's ledger had been quietly canceled, the board minutes noting only that the company had chosen to remain independent under new operational safeguards. Silas Larkin's pension carried a line item now that hadn't existed before, and down at the far end of the service floor, a small classroom had been fitted out with workbenches for 6 apprentices who'd never met Diane Boone, and would nonetheless learn her name before they learned to change a transmission. The tow truck sat in the same service lane it always had, dented in the same places, engine idling with the same familiar cough on cold mornings, except for a small brass plate beside the door handle now, engraved simply, Founding Partner. Beneath it, a decal in Diane's own handwriting, copied faithfully from an old dispatch log Grant had kept all these years, read the Diane Boone Apprentice Program, and Elsie sat in the passenger seat, tracing the letters of her mother's name with one finger, slow and careful, the way her father studied anything worth understanding. 2 knocks, she said, not really asking. Always 2, Grant said, checking his mirrors, easing the truck out of the lane exactly as he had every morning for 6 years. Nothing about the motion changed at all, except that now the whole world finally knew what the truck and the man driving it had been worth the entire time. If you believe quiet honesty deserves to outlast the paperwork built to bury it, you already know why this story mattered.